Hi everyone, this is Dr. Amanda with the Writing Center. Today's workshop is going to be about constructing an argument. There's a lot more to it than just yelling. In order to construct an argument, we first need to know what an argument is and how an argument works. So arguments are attempts to convince or persuade someone, and lots of things are arguments even without us realizing it. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we recognize an argument? Well, an easy thing would be, oh, that person is yelling, or they use the words, well, actually, a lot. Obviously, when someone is trying to convince you of something, you're dealing with an argument. But there are some things that are arguments even without us realizing it. I would argue that it is all argument. In fact, I'm creating an argument here. One of the first things I'm trying to convince you of is that more attention needs to be paid to how arguments are constructed. I've got a lot of claims that I'm making throughout this presentation. Anytime we are taking a position, we're making an argument. At the very least, we are trying to convince our audience that our ideas are worthy of consideration and have some merit. So we're at least worth listening to. That means every thesis statement in every paper is an argument. Traditionally, arguments are texts that make claims and provide support for that claim through evidence, detail, description, and example. But anytime we express our point of view in a paper, we're really making an argument. The argument is that our point of view is valid and should be taken seriously. Your teacher might call something an argumentative essay, but really when they call it that, it just means that the argument there is more obvious in those type of essays. If we think about arguments in a broader sense, then many of us have already written argumentative papers, even though they weren't called that at the time. In your papers, you may have already tried to prove that your interpretation of a text was worth considering, that your stance between two different points of view is the correct stance to take, or that your understanding of a situation is worth considering. So you've tried at some point to convince an audience that your views on a topic made sense. That topic can be anything from a historical event to a work of literature to a scientific experiment. Recognizing an argument also has to do with critical thinking. So what is critical thinking? First of all, it's central to university education. It's not critical in a negative sense. It's critical in a sense that it looks at parts and how things fit together. It asks good questions: who, what, where, why, when, and how. It doesn't accept things at face value and will go and seek more information to validate claims. It also asks us to consider assumptions and implications, including our own. It's really a form of analysis, and argumentation and analysis go hand in hand. When we think critically about arguments, we question not only what an argument is, but also what side is an author taking. What are we trying to be convinced or persuaded to accept or believe? If we're being asked to do something, what is it we're being asked to do? We can also, because we're learning how to construct our own arguments, look at the examples before us. How are the arguments we're reading being constructed? And how well are they making their case? Are we convinced as a member of their audience? So when we analyze arguments, we may need to consider the author's point of view, their approach, their use of something called argumentative appeals, like pathos, ethos, and logos, which we'll talk about in a second. The author's use of argumentative elements like claims, evidence, reasons, examples. These things all add up to support, and support is crucial. You can't just run into a room, yell something, and run away. Not on an argumentative paper. We can actually learn a lot by looking at how other people construct their arguments if we pay attention and think critically. Now, as writers, we should be considering our own readers because they'll be thinking about similar things. As readers, we should notice the tactics someone takes in an argument. We should note how convincing their evidence is, how logical or illogical their explanations are, and whether or not we think they're doing a good job defending their position. So as writers, we should consider our own readers in the same way, because they'll be thinking about similar things. So let's talk about the elements of an argument. An argument consists of a debatable claim, which is made and then qualified, a word that means described or narrowed, so that it's as precise as possible and avoids generalizations. The qualified claims are backed up by reasons based on the author's and sometimes the audience's assumptions. Evidence is provided to support those reasons as true and valid. Well, let's define some terms. Claims actually need to be debatable in order to be an argument. It's very difficult to make an argument about the idea that water is wet. Now, it would be really interesting to see somebody argue that it wasn't. That's an argument I want to hear. But claims have to be debatable in order to be an argument. But anytime you're sharing your point of view, there's probably a debatable factor in there. Qualifiers keep arguments from being overly generalized. A lot of times students will use the words, in society today. Well, that's not very precise. I don't know what society you're talking about. And we know, especially if you've already taken a communications class or a sociology class, that there are societies and cultures and co-cultures. We do not want to overgeneralize, because while an argument could be true or a claim could be true in one situation, we need to be aware that it's not going to be true in all situations. So here's an example. Among students currently enrolled in American four-year universities, something might be true. The qualifiers acknowledge that there are exceptions to things, and they provide a sort of ethical appeal. So ethical appeals have to do with us coming across as aware and informed. And if we make blanket statements, we seem a little bit naive to the fact that there are always going to be exceptions to the claims that we make. More terms that can be useful to us. Reasons. A claim is only as good as the reason attached to it. Reasons are the why in an argument. If you make a claim, you have to talk about why that is. Assumptions are what lies behind the selection of certain reasons as proof of a claim, and these are often unstated. Whenever possible, stating the assumptions is a way to establish some argumentative appeals, and analyzing our own assumptions by critically thinking about our positions is a good way to better understand a topic. The last thing we need is some evidence. Evidence provides support and proof or backing, because not everything can be proved definitively, for the reasons provided. So let's go back to this definition of argument. A debatable claim is made and then qualified to be as precise as possible and avoid generalizations. The qualified claim is backed up by reasons based on the author's assumptions. Evidence is provided to support those reasons as true and valid. The more evidence you have and the more types of evidence, the more likely your argument is to succeed. When I think about evidence, I think about the fact that if I'm making a claim and I give one example, perhaps that's the only example that actually supports my claim, and there could be 100 others that actually point out that I'm wrong. So the more evidence we can provide, and when I'm talking about evidence, I'm talking about college level, reviewed, evaluated, considered, reliable evidence from good sources. Not somebody's grandma, sorry grandmas, not somebody's second cousin, sorry second cousins, and not some crazy person on YouTube. Now, the crazy person on YouTube might be interesting, but they may not have the sort of evidence that we need at the college level. So the evidence and support that we provide can be classified into three categories of argumentative appeals. Those appeals are ethical, emotional, and logical. Appeals are nothing more than attempts on your part to convince the audience that you are worth listening to, have a point, are discussing something important, are right about your point of view, and ultimately have proven your case. So let's start by defining the three types of argumentative appeals. I said they were emotional, logical, and ethical. So the terms I'm going to pathos, emotional appeals, and if we look at the path in that word, we can remind ourselves that sympathy and empathy are both emotions, and pathos is related to emotional appeals. Logos, logical appeal, and we see that logo, we can remember that that's logic, and ethos, an ethical appeal. So good arguments use all three of these appeals to plead their cases to the audience. I think the last one is actually the most important, and we'll talk about why in a second. Pathos is the first one I've listed, emotional appeals. So emotional appeals ask you, what is more convincing, statistics or a powerful image? Does it depend on the situation? Absolutely it does. So why not both? Let's consider this. Give to the Humane Society's anti-puppy mill campaign because the annual result of puppy mill breeding is an estimated 2 to 4 million puppies, many with behavior and or health problems. Perfectly good argument. We've got some statistics, some information in there about range. Automatically looking at those large numbers gets us interested. Let's look at the second. The life of a puppy mill dog who is used for breeding stock is particularly shocking and sad. These dogs receive little or no veterinary care and never see a bed, a treat, or a toy. Breeding animals are commonly killed after their fertility wanes, or they're abandoned or sold to another mill. Cruel and deplorable places, puppy mills continue to thrive because they prey on unwitting consumers who are smitten by too cute for words puppies in pet store windows and on fancy websites. Which was more convincing to you? I actually have problems with both of these arguments. I feel like each of those is taking a different... I feel like each of these quotes takes a different approach to talking about puppy mills. Ideally, the data that in the first example and the passion and description in the second example could be combined to create something that's extraordinarily powerful, but also contains some factual information. Now, I would want to move a step further and talk about where's this information coming from. So the argument in advertisements is buy our thing. They try to make us feel something, but they try to make us feel something that's often sort of negative to our self-esteem, alarms us emotionally. The ad that I'm picturing here is from BMW. It's disguised in some way as a message for the greater good, but the message is still, no matter what, buy our cars. So they're trying to create a good name for themselves here. And why wouldn't they? They can help out the public and come off looking like great people who are very aware and concerned with human life. So how do we create an emotional appeal? Well, we use vivid language. Cruel and deplorable places. Puppy mills continue to thrive because they prey on unwitting customers, so it paints a picture for us. We can also create emotional appeals by playing up the emotional consequences of our argument. Is there some negative outcome to not agreeing with your stance? Can you issue a warning towards the conclusion of your paper? We also need to see the consequences of someone not taking your side or agreeing with your stance. How many people are or will be affected? How severely and how important is this topic to other humans? Show how the argument or topic affects others, and shape your appeal to your audience. But remember, you need to know something about your audience in order to do this. Now here's the dangers of relying on pathos alone. If you're only relying on emotional rather than a logical appeal, then you're probably being manipulative. Many ads rely on emotional appeals without providing evidence. We tend not to like those sorts of ads if we're good analytical thinkers. No one likes to be manipulated. Pathos alone is seldom convincing. Being passionate about something just shows that you're passionate about something. Showing someone the emotional side of an argument can be persuasive, but without other argumentative appeals to support those emotions, appeals to pathos can backfire. And if you don't know your audience very well, it can absolutely backfire. For example, somebody trying to argue for a grade with me and trying to appeal to my maternal instincts is really going to be disappointed. That is the wrong approach for me personally. Pathos doesn't work alone. Logos doesn't work alone as well. But logos really is the center of a lot of arguments. So logos begins with facts. But facts aren't the only way we can appeal to someone's logic. We can use statistics, expert testimony, personal observations, questionnaires, experiments, definitions, and a lot of outside sources. One thing to keep in mind is that people often try to pass facts off as facts. What I mean by that is that facts aren't always entirely factual. Passing quotation mark facts off as actual facts might work for a while, but not with critical thinkers. When someone's facts are actually facts, when they're biased or questionable or unsupported, they can affect an author's ethos. And remember, we'll get to that. That's our third appeal, and the one that I think might be the most important. So this is why we want to use the best support we can. We don't want to give our audience a reason to doubt or dismiss us by doubting or dismissing the sources that we bring in to help support our argument. So how do we create a logical appeal? We need examples, we need explanations, we need illustrations, and I don't mean drawings there. These things don't have to center on other sources. You could provide things like narratives and descriptions based on your own experience, but that really depends on the kind of argument you're creating and maybe even the discipline or course you're taking. And if you need sources, you need to be evaluating those sources in order to find the best sources you can. You also need to think about cause and effects. If this, then this. These are known as logical syllogisms. You may want to be using inductive and deductive reasoning in order to prove your point. Inductive reasoning says a lot of examples prove a point. Deductive says general rules apply to a specific case. And lastly, avoid logical fallacies. I'm going to go through a lot of these, and I bet you've come across these not only in papers and things that you're reading, but in real-life arguments. So we want to avoid logical fallacies in our own work, but point them out in counter-arguments. So I said that syllogisms were important. A syllogism is an if-then argument. But here's some facts. All humans are mortal. All humans eventually die. Dr. Mizameda, that's me, is a human. So if all humans are mortal and all mortals eventually die, then I'll probably die. Eventually. That's a fact. I'm okay with that fact. There's nothing I can do to stop it anyway. Here's some more syllogisms. This one's from the helpful people at Purdue's Online Writing Lab, which is a really great resource if you're doing any sort of paper, including an argumentative one. They provided two premises and projects funded by taxpayer dollars should benefit a majority of the public. That's premise one. The proposed stadium construction benefits very few members of the public. That's premise two. The conclusion that this arguers come up with is, therefore, the stadium construction should not be funded by taxpayer dollars. We can find a lot of exceptions to this, and certain people could come back with some counter-arguments on this. We know that this person may have a difficult road before them in their argument if most people are really into the idea of a new stadium. But this syllogism is a logical structure that's easy to follow. I also mentioned inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning suggests that many examples prove a point. So if every time you eat strawberries you break out in hives, then you can use inductive reasoning to logically claim you're allergic to strawberries. But how do you prove it to an audience of your mom? How many examples does it take? So if you eat strawberries, you break out into hives, first time it's ever happened, are you allergic to strawberries? Well, it depends. You could be. But what if it was something else you had eaten earlier that day? What if you had brushed against something? What if you're using a new fabric softener? There's so many outside variables. Now, if every time, 3 or more times you eat strawberries, you break out in hives, then you can use inductive reasoning to say, yes, I'm probably allergic to strawberries. Inductive reasoning draws a conclusion based on many examples. Now, I'm going to step away here for a second and suggest that in college-level writing, just inductive reasoning alone isn't always going to be the best choice. There are things that are more evidence-based. So if you want to prove that you're allergic to strawberries, I would go to the doctor and get tested for a strawberry allergy. I've eaten strawberries, I break out in hives, and I went and got tested, and it turns out, yes, I'm allergic to strawberries. So more kinds of evidence equal a more secure argument. Deductive reasoning suggests that general rules apply to specific situations. So here's an example. If non-renewable sources do not exist in infinite supply, and oil is a non-renewable resource, then oil doesn't exist in an infinite supply. So that's not just another cool syllogism, it's deductive ethos or ethical appeal actually has to do with you, the arguer, and your credibility and competence as determined by your audience. Are you someone the audience can trust? Do you seem informed? Do you seem obviously biased? And sometimes bias is okay, but we need to be aware of it. And so does the author. The audience has to trust in you and your expertise first. Your audience is going to be asking themselves, why should I listen to this person anyway? Ethical appeals support the credibility, moral character, goodwill of the argument's creator, and more important, your competency. As an audience member, we have to ask if an author is a person we can believe. A good argument establishes the authority of the author or their believability. This can be done through language, selection of logical evidence, some discussion of the author's personal familiarity with the topic, or even their consideration of counter-arguments. So how do we establish ourselves as a source of trust, experience, and expertise? One thing you can do is try to find some common ground with your audience, something everyone can agree upon, and build your argument up from there. You want to consider any counter-arguments and all points of view that are different than your own. Being aware of the arguments against your stance makes you seem like a considerate person, because it actually makes you a considerate person. You also want to consider any assumptions you're making in your paper and address them if necessary. Don't manipulate facts or figures. Avoid logical fallacies and use the best resources available to back up your claims. Think about the things that you're reading. So if an author of a text you're reading comes across as someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, are you going to continue to read them? No, they seem like they're full of crap. And that's the fastest way for an argument to fail. So I said, one of the things that we need to avoid here is logical fallacies. So I'm going to go through some of these pretty quickly, but some of these more in depth. Logical fallacies are flaws in arguments based on either faulty assumptions or faulty logic. There's a lot of different kinds of logical fallacies, but they all work the same way. They either leave out information that an audience needs, or they unintentionally mislead their audience. If we feel as an audience intentionally or unintentionally misled, we tend to doubt the author of that paper. So we need to avoid logical fallacies when we're writing. But because you're going to be bringing in counter-arguments, because you're a good logical and ethical arguer, you're going to need to keep out for these kinds of fallacies when you're reading, because they're a good place for you to point out an issue with someone else's logic and promote your own stance. The first logical fallacy we're going to talk about is a post hoc fallacy. Post hoc fallacies make a faulty cause and effect assumption that has to do with time. So because one thing happened at or around the same time as another thing doesn't necessarily mean those. The increased manufacture and sale of pornographic material coincides with an increase in sex-related crimes such as rape and incest. Obviously, pornography leads to sex-related crimes. Well, multiple studies don't actually support this premise, but even more so, this isn't logical. Because these things happen at the same time and somehow seem related, doesn't mean that they are related. Crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate. There's also been a rise in the number of teenagers getting tattoos and piercings. The conclusion is obvious. These things lead to deviant behavior. I've got tattoos. I've got piercings. I'm not out robbing houses. This is a very strange assumption to make. Because there's been an increase in the number of teenagers getting tattoos and piercings, and it happens to coincide with something else, does not mean those things are related. Now, if they are related, we need a lot more information. I can imagine, say, a very, 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 very small town that has never had any theft or robbery. All of a sudden, there's a group of teenagers there. They're all tattooed, all pierced up, and they've been robbing houses. Well, the first thing is they have been robbing houses. But it's not the tattoos and piercings that are causing those. Just because one thing happened around or after the same time as something else doesn't mean they're related. If those things are related, then I need to know how and why. Non sequitur fallacies assume a cause and effect which are actually unrelated because one thing doesn't actually follow logically, but it only seems associated. Post hoc fallacies are a type of non sequitur fallacy, but it exists around time. So school dormitories are huge buildings. Making the assumption that because a building is big, the rooms are big, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Sometimes it's true, but in this instance, huge dorms does not result in huge rooms. Ad hominem fallacies are one of those distraction fallacies. They attack the messenger rather than the message. Allen Ginsberg has argued in favor of abolishing censorship of literature, but Ginsberg's arguments are nothing but trash. Ginsberg, is a pot-smoking homosexual and an advocate of the drug culture. Yeah, so? All of that might actually be true, but it has nothing to do with the argument being made, which makes it totally unethical. and illogical. They pointed out some things about Ginsburg's life that they feel mainstream America might disapprove of. Now, this is an older argument. Ginsburg, though, is a very well-known American poet with a history of fighting for free speech of all kinds. He's an activist. That wasn't mentioned in this. Instead of mentioning his record in advocacy or his many awards in poetry and literature, they've decided to mention some personal things that don't have anything to do with the fact that censorship in literature is a really negative thing. Now, begging the question asks the audience to assume a premise that is itself controversial or debatable. All intentional acts of killing human beings are morally wrong. The death penalty is an intentional act of killing a human being, therefore the death penalty is wrong. All of these premises, so we have two premises and a conclusion, are debatable. All intentional acts of killing human beings are morally wrong. Well, a lot of people have different views on that. You're really going to have to explain that and qualify that, or at least give some examples of what they're talking about. Conclusion can't stand if the premises, one or both of them, are debatable. So just mentioning a debatable topic doesn't mean that someone is begging the question. Things are debatable. Not everything is cut and dry. The problem is if somebody is presenting something as fact when it is in fact debatable. False analogies insist that because two things share like qualities, they're like in all respect. Here's an example. Harper's new car is bright blue, has leather upholstery, and gets excellent gas mileage. Crawley's new car is also bright blue and has leather upholstery. Therefore, it probably gets excellent gas mileage too. So the logic of this argument is that all blue cars get a good mile per hour? That makes zero sense. We see these false analogies made all the time, though, and we don't really blink at them because they're such a common logical fallacy. So be on the lookout for that. Just because something shares one quality doesn't mean it shares all qualities. Appeals to authority claim statements from experts or credible witnesses, but don't identify their sources, or they cite sources that aren't experts at all. Here's a quote from The Water Boy. My mama says crocodiles are ornery on account of all them teeth in their head and no toothbrush. It's not the medulla oblongata. Now, I'm going to assume that mama, no matter what she says about crocodiles, is probably not a good authority on what makes crocodiles ornery or not. But what if this person's mama was the world's leading herpetologist on crocodiles? Herpetologist means somebody who studies lizards and reptiles. I would want to know that. That's important. That actually makes this person's mama an authority. Leaving that out, though, doesn't tell me anything. We see this a lot in politics. We see this a lot in newspapers. Now, sometimes newspapers are unable to identify their sources, and that's fine. That's a different situation. Usually when that happens, they try to corroborate or they qualify it saying sources, unnamed sources suggest that, and they identify that something's unnamed. So sources close to the senator say he's abusing government funding. Sources close to the senator could be anyone from their third cousin to somebody they met at the grocery store. We're not quite sure what that means. We need to be really specific, especially with an accusation like that. And yet, we tend to see these appeals to authority all the time. These are problems. They affect someone's credibility, and they open things up into some really wild sort of assumptions. Either or fallacies are very interesting because they don't take into account middle ground. Either you use UltraGuard deodorant or you will suffer from perspiration odor. I know we've seen things like this again and again, but there are other deodorants in the world. They do exist. Either or fallacies don't take into account that often there are going to be several approaches or solutions to something, and that there are always going to be exceptions to rules. Red herrings are intentional digressions that veer the argument off focus. They're tricky and they distract readers. So this is another one of those logical fallacies that serves as a distraction. And I see these all the time. Here's an example. Consumer's Digest reported that GE light bulbs last longer than Sylvania bulbs. But do you realize that GE used to be this country's major manufacturer of nuclear weapons? The social cost of GE's irresponsible behavior has been tremendous. Among other things, we are left with thousands of tons of nuclear waste with nowhere to put it. Obviously, Consumer's Digest is wrong. Now, some of the things in there may actually be true, but it has nothing to do with how long light bulbs last. Nothing. The argument is whether or not these light bulbs last longer than another kind of light bulb. And there's been absolutely no facts or information or even examples provided to us to disprove the statement about GE light bulbs lasting longer than Sylvania. Instead, what we get is almost an ad hominem towards a business at this point. Again, this is a red herring. It's intentionally gets you off focus. Something interesting about the word red herring is it's often used in detective novels or mystery TV shows to identify something that is a misleading bit of evidence. Other fallacies. Strawman fallacies are a kind of fallacy that mischaracterizes an opposing position as simple or easily defeated. An appeal to ignorance is a kind of fallacy which says, I don't understand all aspects of something, so what I say is true. So nobody can prove definitively that aliens don't exist, therefore they must be real? Slippery slope fallacies are a pileup of usually post hoc fallacies that lead to some strange conclusions by assuming that consequences will follow a specific course of events, when, at any point, something could go off course. Tu quoque or U2 fallacies are appeals to hypocrisy. It diverts blame and distracts. So if somebody says, so-and-so did it and they didn't get in trouble, well, that's an appeal to hypocrisy. Well, they didn't get in trouble. I just did what they did. It doesn't make it the right thing to do. Hasty generalizations assume that something is true all of the time for all persons in all situations. We know that that is entirely untrue. Equivocation fallacies hide truth, so another distraction, behind euphemisms with an attempt to mislead or deceive. You see this a lot in advertising and politics. So hiding truth behind language. His political party wants to spend your precious tax dollars on big government, but my political party is planning strategic federal investment in critical programs. That is literally the same thing. Appeal to pity. This is when emotion gets manipulated. It's particularly misleading when it lays on a not related to the argument at hand. So if somebody starts saying, think of the children. Why? Are they relevant right now? I'll think of the children, but you were making an argument that had nothing to do with that. Bandwagon fallacies are very interesting. It's when something's accepted or considered right because it's popular. Just because something is popular, and I'm looking at you, flat earthers, doesn't mean that it's true. If all of your friends jumped off a bridge, then would you do it too? That's something a mom might say, but it's a good question. So bandwagon fallacies say just because a lot of people believe it doesn't mean it's true, because we know that sometimes a lot of people can be pretty foolish. So why do we worry about this stuff? Well, we worry because in an argument we have a goal. Our goal is to convince our audience that our point of view is the correct point of view, or at least that our point of view is worth considering or listening to. We worry about it because it isn't just facts that convince us of things. Though facts are where things start, and we do want to have good facts from good evaluated sources, we also want to think about how we're shaping our argument, how human beings are swayed by emotional appeals, how sometimes we're convinced by the outward honesty and passion of an arguer. We worry about this stuff because if we aren't careful, we can defeat our purpose. We can alienate or even offend our audience, which means that our argument fails entirely anyway. We can call our ethics into question. And we can have our arguments dismantled by another critical thinker who is worrying about this stuff. The most important reason of argumentation, if we don't, then our argument could fail. We've been reverse engineering an argument this whole time. When you're writing an argumentative paper, start with a thesis and then come up with some reasons. A few good reasons are often better than a lot of weaker reasons. Gather evidence and know your stuff because your audience will not believe you otherwise. Remember that evidence doesn't speak for itself. You have to explain what it adds up to, what makes it credible, and you need to be evaluating those sources very closely. Look at your opposing viewpoints. If you don't know the opposition, then you're in a disadvantage. Also, addressing counter-arguments makes you more convincing. But please treat counter-arguments fairly. Look for places of consensus where you can agree and then shape that argument that comes out of that agreement towards your stance. You want to organize your argument logically, usually from least to most controversial. Make connections between pieces of evidence or points. You've got to walk them through your points carefully. You've got to provide examples, and those examples need to come from convincing sources, credible sources. And once you have those examples, you've got to explain. Lead your reader through your points carefully. Do not make them do the work. Really think about your audience. How do you reach them? Cite your sources. Citing your sources makes you look professional, and looking professional adds to your ethos. Please don't manipulate people. If you try to manipulate someone through an argument, you're probably going to fail. Don't lose sight of your goal. That's your thesis. Remember, you have a goal. And remember that conclusions should be direct and comment on why it's important to see things your way. Show us the big picture at the end. Tell us